Welcome to the course Digital Storytelling. My name is Luka Piškorec. I'm a lecturer in Design of Structures at Department of Architecture, and I will show you a little bit some basic ideas, some concepts behind what a collage in general is, and how it is, how the kind of some important concepts to know that are related to the workflow and also to the kind of digital medium. And some concepts come directly, of course, from Photoshop, but they are universal for the digital realm, let's say. And then I will show you also some examples. And they are not all related to your assignments, but they might kind of, some of them point to what the assignment will be. But they're all maybe, I try to pick them correctly so that they can really reflect what you might be able to do at the end of this course. Okay, so basic concepts and examples. Okay, so collage as a technique. Collage, basically, I didn't even know this, but it turns out that Pablo Picasso worked in collage technique. This is 1912, so more than 100 years ago, one of his early works. So started with that. That was kind of also at that time, early modern movement in art, and Dadaist kind of movement used that. That was almost a little bit kind of an anti-art movement at that time. Basically cutting out, pasting. And this is in a way a great reference, because what we will be doing in Photoshop as a collage is we are basically doing the same thing. We are, in a way, cutting out things and we paste them, or we collage them together, except that in the digital medium, we have a lot more freedom, so we can create these transitions much more seamlessly. So we're not doing digital illustration. We are literally doing a digital collage. Okay, and this may be a more famous example. This collage called "Just What Is It That Makes Today's Home So Different, So Appealing" by Hamilton and McHale from the 50s. This is actually considered to be the start of the pop art movement. And in the pop art, that's basically the movement that really prominently used collage as a technique. So again, kind of cutting out photographs and then pasting them and then kind of painting a little bit in between. And again, we can basically do the same thing in Photoshop, or that's at least how we will be using it, that workflow. Okay, but before we go well, I'll explain you a little bit sort of the context around collage and in general digital photography. Or so also here on the top right, there is always a small note that explains how the image in the slide was created. And for those ones, for some slides that will come later, maybe it's kind of interesting for you then to have a sort of a reference to know kind of, okay, how was this image actually created? Of course, this is just an analog photograph. And on the bottom left, I always try to give a reference and also the kind of authors of the image or some reference you can kind of look it up later. So the name Photoshop of the software Photoshop that we will be using comes literally from the kind of the place, or the Photoshop, the place where you develop photographs, and this is one of these basically dark rooms, or kind of a Photoshop, so this is already 150 years ago. So basically a dark room where the photos would be developed, and this one specifically used this wet collodion photography process where photographs had to be developed when they were still wet. So basically the darkroom had to be close to where the photo was taken. That's why they would be placed in wagons, and then basically this wagon had to be, close to the area where you would be photographing. So they became kind of these portable rooms. And when you develop photographs, there are certain techniques that you can use. And I'm not, again, an expert in analog photography. Actually, my brother has been doing quite a lot of kind of really analog photography development, but aside from that, I know that there are different techniques. So the development of photograph is not just straightforward, or you can do basically editing of the photograph. So two of these darkroom techniques are called burning and dodging, and they literally look like this, basically as when you would develop a photograph. So you would have light shining through a film. It's not really shown here. throw film onto a photo paper or a plate, a photographic plate, and you would basically, with certain devices, you would control how much light is coming in onto that plate. So you could overexpose or underexpose certain areas of the image. Also here, with this technique, you're basically you're adding extra light to certain areas because you're kind of darkening the everything else, and you have basically a hole where the light comes through. So you're kind of, this is called burning, or so you're in a way darkening this part of the image by adding more light here. It has to do with this kind of reverse, or the fact that film is actually a negative of the image, and the opposite effect is dodging or lightening the image, where you basically have small small devices that are like covers, so you would basically underexpose certain areas of the image. Okay, I hope I got everything correct, because as I said, photography is not really my expertise. And then basically what you then do, you can kind of edit the photographs while you develop. Also, for example, in this case, you would maybe try to underexpose the sky because there's a lot of light coming from the sky, in order to get maybe fine details of this skyline and maybe clouds, if there are any clouds. And certain darker areas like the shadows here, the reflection, or maybe this railing, you would try to overexpose it in order to or you would try to kind of make them lighter, or in order to get the detail out. Or so you're in a way, and then of course first you would do this sort of map to kind of see, you know, which parts need to be exposed to what extent. And photographer Ansel Adams even wrote a book about it. These are called kind of zoning. Or so you would create these zones, and you would control how much light there is on the image. And this is a completely analog technique. This is another one here. So you can see this area of the reflection of the car is quite dark, but you can actually kind of make it a bit lighter in order to have certain details come out. And maybe the face here is too dark, so you're also kind of trying to bring it a bit up, out, and so on. So this is a completely analog technique, but turns out that, I mean, Photoshop was created in a way to mimic these techniques, or so photo editing techniques. So that's why there are a lot of tools in Photoshop that basically have the same name as this darkroom developing technique. So there's literally a tool called Dodge tool and Burn tool, and I guess there's a technique also where you use a sponge. Or so here's the Dodge kind of makes the image lighter, and the Burn makes the image darker. Or yeah, and then for example, for us, this will be useful because again, we can darken the areas of the image, and we can, for example, create shadows or on the fly, or the opposite, we can create kind of areas of light. Also, when you work in collage, you have maybe photographs or parts of the image that have different light conditions, and then when you put them together, they look off, and then you're trying to bring them closer together. You're trying to kind of blend them seamlessly. Then you would also use this kind of Dodge and Burn in order to bring them closer together. Okay, so there's basically an analog between this sort of darkroom development techniques and the software itself, and in that sense, a whole kind of workflow. And there are many more examples there that I will show maybe when I'm showing the software closer. Yeah, so something that is of course very important to realize is that when we work with analog photography, then we can talk about grain on the photographic film, on photographic paper. There's basically grain, this granularity. But when we work in a computer, of course, there is no grain, but we have pixels if you work with raster images, or in a way we can work with vector data. So again, those of you who took my course in autumn, Basics Digital Storytelling, there we worked with Rhino and we worked with vector data. So this one on the left, but now we will be working exclusively with raster workflow. So we will work with pixel images, and that's it. We are working kind of with pixels. And then of course, pixels are nothing else but sort of values. Or so you have a matrix of values. So you have you have basically a grid, and this is a grayscale image. So you just need one value to describe basically the tone, how dark the image is. And depending on how many bits the pixel has, this number can have a different range. If you want to have color, you need to have more numbers, or so you would have sort of like maybe 3 values or 4 values, depending on the color space you're using. Or so in a way, we are when we work with the pixels, we are basically working. This is how our data looks like in the computer memory. And in a way, when you work with Photoshop, you really have to, well, you have to be a bit kind of aware of that these are just kind of numbers behind, and then many operations that we are doing are basically operations on these numbers. So it's kind of very data kind of driven approach. Okay, a little bit of color theory. There is the RGB additive color model, and there's the CMYK subtractive color model. Or so the one on the left, that's basically how your screen works. So that's the emissive spectrum. So we can combine these primary colors, red, green, and blue, in order to get the white. And that's basically how your screen works. So everything that kind of shines light works in this way. So basically, R, G, and B could basically be 3 values or 3 colors that when we combine them in different proportions, we can get, I wouldn't say any other color, but we can get a lot of other colors. Or so we can't really get any color, but we can get quite a lot of them. And that's for sure, again, how your screens work, and TVs, mobile phones, and so on. CMYK is the opposite of that. So that's the subtractive color model. So it works with absorption of wavelengths. Or so basically you have ink on paper. So that's basically the model that is used with printing. So you would have ink on paper, and this ink is reflecting only certain wavelengths and absorbs all the other ones. So when you combine them together, you basically get black. Or and here I have an example how that works. So we are not really working with printing. So we are not so interested in CMYK, but just kind of to put this reference here. Also, RGB model is maybe this one here, or this is actually grayscale. But and when you work in print, you have this. I don't even know how this is called. These are this kind of, I think it's called a dot matrix. Or so you have the blobs of different colors, and they are basically cyan, magenta, and yellow. And then you would have key, which is basically black. Or so you could add extra black in order to make certain areas black, because when you add these 3 together, they don't form a really nice black. They form like some kind of a maybe ugly black, or kind of a pale black. So you can add an extra black kind of pigment in order to make certain areas even sort of just have a bit stronger contrast. But you're basically combining these blobs of color, and yeah, that's basically how, for example, inkjet printers work. Inkjet printer is it kind of jets the ink out in these blobs, and these blobs are basically exactly these dots, more or less. Okay, and then when we are working in basically any digital program, any digital software, and we talk about color, we talk about these basically color spaces. Or so this is example from Photoshop. So this is some color, specifically magenta. So this is the CMYK code for it. So we have CMYK, cyan component is 0, magenta is 100%, yellow is 0, and then key or black is 0. So this is sort of full magenta in CMYK, and then these are its corresponding coordinates or corresponding values in RGB, and then there are some other systems like this HSB, so hue, saturation, and B should be like lightness or something, but I'm not sure exactly what B stands for. Okay, and there's some other ones here as well. And then there's the hexadecimal representation of it. So basically, when you're in a computer, and again, when you work with color, you have to just be aware that this is how color is represented. And for sure, if you're kind of picking a color, you can always sort of pick it by either going through these. This is basically a section of the color space, so you can kind of pick it manually by sliding around, or you can just, if you know the values, you can kind of use directly values here. This is, for example, blue. Or so RGB, red component is 0, green component is 0, and blue is 255, which is the maximum. That's 8-bit color, 8-bit, yeah. 2 to the power of 8. So that's the maximum blue in RGB, and then corresponding value in all the other color spaces. Okay, and this is somehow related to these color spaces, or that there's the RGB core space, and this is this HSP core space. So they are kind of they're trying to sort of encompass as many colors as possible, but turns out some of them are just not there. So your screen cannot really show all the colors, or maybe different screens can show a bit different colors. But yeah, so this is kind of the most color theory that you need to know for this course. Or so just to kind of know that this RGB is basically a cube, and this here is a section of that cube, and this is kind of you're moving through the sections. Or that's it. This is basically a section of that cube here. Okay. Then another important concept when we talk about so all the pixels. So we have an image now. We have all the pixels in the image. Is the histogram. Or so histogram will appear. We can basically see, or it'll appear right at the beginning when we started using Photoshop. Histogram basically shows us how many colors, or how many colors are there in the image, and it's a bit easier to wrap around your head, or wrap your head around it when we just talk about grayscale. It's a bit harder when we talk about color images, because then we have sort of we have free histograms for 3 different channels. But here, for example, in grayscale, this is the image, and this is its corresponding histogram. And yeah, it gets a bit time to get used to it. So, for example, here we can see if these are blacks, we see that in this image there are no blacks. There are no hard blacks in this image. Then there's a lot of gray, and then there are no high whites, or there are no highlights that are completely white. Here, the image is kind of all the color, or all the tonal values are in this range here. And then kind of there's a process, there are now different processes that we can perform on this histogram. This is basically just like a mathematical formula or mathematical function that we can sort of equalize these values. Or so we can edit the image in a way to spread these values out, so that we sort of have an equal, this is kind of the sum of all the values, that we sort of have a, how do I call it? Yeah, we have kind of a similar proportion of grayscale, or grayscale values that are sort of evenly distributed across the spectrum. So we basically take these values and we kind of spread them out. Yeah, and we have more of them, their gaps are bigger. We have less of them, they are kind of just tighter together. And then we get an image that has a stronger contrast, or looks a bit better. So these are some things that we can then do when we understand, when we basically look at images as data. And I'll show you some of these, how you can do some of these things in Photoshop. Just makes the image kind of easier to read, and yeah, it just looks better. And there are some questions in the chat. Yes, interesting video about color. Perfect. Keep them coming. Okay, so again, this course is not really about color theory, but I have to explain some of these things just before we start, otherwise, so you're not confused. Histogram is nothing kind of hard. Okay, let's continue. Okay, another very important concept in Photoshop are layers, and these layers are basically exactly, when we talk about analog collage, or collage as an artistic technique, we also talk about layers. We have different elements, and we put them on top of each other in a way. So in Photoshop, we work with these layers. Layers are parts of an image. So they're basically a collection of pixels, and there's a stack, or so we kind of put them literally on top of each other, and the order, we have kind of a list of layers here, and the order of these layers basically determines which pixels are shown on the top and which ones are on the bottom. So if I have 2 images that are kind of beside each other, then it doesn't really matter. The order doesn't matter. But if I have 2 images that overlap, suddenly I have a problem, or I have to choose basically which image is on top, which pixels do I show. More questions? Okay. And then there's something else that I didn't really mention yet. When we talk about these values here, there's something else that is missing from this mix. There's something called an alpha channel. So a pixel can also have a transparency. So that's very, very important. There's a so-called alpha channel, which is a separate channel, not shown here, unfortunately, but that's basically amount of transparency, or so we can make our pixels transparent. And that's very important because it means that we can have parts of the image. So we can have, like a crop of an image, and we can have the background transparent, so completely empty. And this is handled with this alpha value. So if I have an alpha value set to 100 or 0%, I guess 100% is 100% opacity. So completely opaque image. So all the full pixel is shown. If I have it set to 0, then I have nothing. So I have an invisible layer, and that's basically how in a computer, how Photoshop is handling sort of no pixels or no paper. So I can in a way have invisible pixels. So you'll see how this works. It's very simple. So basically I can have transparency in my pixels as well. Okay, and now to kind of show a little bit how this idea of layering or putting two things on top of each other seems easy, but it's really not. And that's actually where the power of Photoshop comes in. So if I have these two images, this is actually from a project from my studio. It's called The Machine in the Garden. So I'll show you some of these examples also later, or in later sessions. These are basically hybrids produced by this big gun script. So I'll show you a little bit that later. But basically I have two images, and now what does it mean to put these images together? Or I can just overlay them. And in Photoshop, this is called kind of normal. This is a normal blending mode with 50% opacity. So there's an image on the top, and its pixels are they're set to 50% opacity. That means the alpha channel is set to 50. That means there's just 50% of the color comes through. It's almost like having a transparent film. And this looks simple enough. I can of course change this opacity to make the front image come a bit further, in view or not. But turns out that I can actually blend this in different ways. So there are different blending modes in Photoshop. So here on the left is a blending mode called the darken. So only basically I'm in a way onto the lower image, I'm projecting only the darker pixels from the top. So this is this house here, that's the top image, and only the darker pixels are only projected down. So if there's anything in this left image that is lighter, like maybe the sky, this will not be included, or it will just be removed. So I'm in a way blending only the darker areas of the top image. Or I can do exactly the opposite, or I can blend the lighter, if there's a lighter pixel on the top, that one gets a priority. So I'm basically choosing sort of which pixels are shown and which not. And here specifically, I'm just choosing which one is lighter, which one is darker. Okay, then some other blending modes like color burn, or this one is called hard light. And these ones are a bit more weird. It's called difference and divide. Also, what does it mean to create an image difference? Or if I have pixels and they are just numbers, they're represented as numbers, as I mentioned before, then I can subtract one number from the other one, and whatever I get, I can just say, okay, now this is my new color. And then I can get some weird tones, because I think if you go into negative, then I'm sort of flipping the values, or so I get this negative. Or the other way is it's called divide, or so I can divide these values. So I'm basically just performing like simple arithmetic on these pixels. So these are the blending modes. And now you can imagine I can additionally, for example, choose also the opacity. So how much of this effect is being taken in, and things can get really complex really fast. So the question is, how do I know which blending mode to use? Well, it depends on what I need. That's why kind of experience in Photoshop is, or in general in this digital collage means a lot. So just after many years or months of using, you will kind of realize, okay, this blending mode I can use, to get this effect, and some other blending mode I can use to get another effect. It all just depends on what you want to do. And again, experience helps a lot. So if you're kind of a pro in Photoshop, you would already know, if I put these two images together, and this effect that I can get if I use whatever, this type of overlay. So Photoshop is just providing you with this option, but it really comes to experience. And personally, I'm also not an expert, so I'm using them already for years or decades, but I'm also not really an expert in in these, but I usually know what I need to use when I need it, or it really kind of comes to experience. Okay, let me just see the time. Okay, 2 o'clock. Okay, and now there are some other examples. This is actually from Philipp Scherer, who is a Swiss architect, and he got kind of quite famous because he's doing these sort of photo collages. So this one is from 2008, and that's basically more or less what we could do. So he's not really rendering anything, or he has a bit of kind of rendering involved for some of his projects, but these ones here called Bildbau, they are basically, he has a sketch in the background, and then he uses that sketch to kind of collage different materials together. He kind of distorts them to create these sort of minimalist looking basically buildings. Also, you can go on his website and have a look at his pieces. So these are just digital collages, and of course he's Swiss, so these are kind of very minimalist photos, but they're in a way very architectural, or they give you a sense of an object, of a little bit of context and so on. And this is from, it's called Leerstellen, which in German means empty spaces, or empty places. So also this is kind of very simple. So he just has a photograph, and then he kind of collages in just like some black shapes in this case. So in a way, an image like this is actually really easy to do in Photoshop. Okay, and now the last part of this input lecture is basically collage as a storytelling device. So that gets us now a little bit more into the topic of the course, or kind of what the assignment is about. So we'll be using a collage as a storytelling device, or so we would use it to tell a story. And this is another example. Well, you basically have this image kind of parts. This is all just from Google image search, or so you just kind of find these parts and you basically cut them out, and you can create a collage. Or so this was just for a company like an ad that I created just back in the day when I was still playing around. Okay, so different parts come in, and of course, as we work in the digital medium, we can create these transitions very, very smooth, or so they can be very. It's almost like transitions are almost invisible. Okay, this is another example where transitions are a bit harder, and this is I think maybe again some of you maybe saw this already because I showed it also at in autumn. So this is a house, an old house, and we had photographs from different times of the same house. The idea was just to kind of collage basically the photographs together so that the house somehow becomes complete. The house is the part that is kind of holding the whole image, and then characters kind of appear in and out, or so they're just kind of there depending on where the photo was taken. So the house basically provides us with this sort of a skeleton, this frame that kind of organizes all the other elements around. And of course, these are taken at different times. So sometimes there's the same person appearing at different stages in life. Or so in a way, some things are fixed, but kind of the story is told. It's sort of like an asynchronic image. So when I talk about collage as a storytelling device, this is a little bit what I mean. Also, you're basically telling a story, in this case, story of a place or of a building, but also of the kind of the family that owns the vineyard and so on, the family members. Okay. Then this is a series of student projects done by a Swiss, students of a Swiss architecture office, Made In. So Made In is, you can just Google them, Made In. They're called Made In Switzerland. And they had a studio in Zurich back in the day, and they did this kind of also collages with the students. So I took some of these out. And there's always kind of a small title of the image. This one is called Cloud Foundation, where there's sort of a kind of a mounting and some kind of entrance here. These are all black and white. Deconstruction site. So I think this is New York, and there's some kind of a sinkhole here. On their website, they actually have also references to all the parts of the collage parts that were used. Unfortunately, I didn't include them here. I just included the name of the authors. So these are all students, and this was done sort of as an introductory exercise into a studio. Or so this was not really even a design. This was just basically playing around while we are learning the tools. Urban Carrier, or this I forgot the name of this building. This the one, the building in New York that goes into a corner, and then the kind of the aircraft carrier on the top. This is Piazza di San Marco, and there's the facade on one of the, well, the facades are just kind of multiplied on the top, kind of form this sort of inverted pyramid. So this is in Venice, and this one is called the terminal. So I guess this is the, I guess this is this is Rome, and then these are the basically a terminal for planes. This is one of the French these French gardens in Paris or somewhere close to Paris, and then kind of turn into a runway. Often in these compositions, symmetry helps a lot. Or so you will also see it's kind of easier to work with an image if there's a certain symmetry. It's also easier to read. Also, in general, easier to just work as an image. So if you can, when you create your compositions, if you can introduce symmetry into an image, this is always very good. Especially if there's symmetry already in the space, there it's very good then to catch it through a composition of the image. Or there's no point in taking kind of a sideways view of the space if the space is symmetric, or that's at least my advice. Okay, and this is a collage just based on sort of like paintings, other paintings. This one here as well. So kind of different paintings cut out very carefully and just kind of layered on top of each other. This is from Uncle Vanya Play. And this is even a photograph of an old space that is kind of collage sort of the characters of the play inside. These are very small, I apologize, but it's somehow how it worked out. Okay, so we had, so I was running these workshops called Republic some years back, and mostly we did it like kind of a black and white sort of line drawings, but in some of them we also created these collages. So this is one of these collages. This is actually the city of Motovun, which is a small city in Croatia, a medieval city on top of a hill, and here's just collaged kind of on top of this sort of kind of a mountain or cliff in the middle of the ocean. This is one old painting. Okay, this is also Motovun. So the Motovun is not really close to the sea, as I think there's I forgot 30, 40, 50 kilometers to the sea, but it is on the hill. So here it's kind of shown as a sort of as an island in this sort of sea, in this archipelago. Or so basically we would just use kind of image from Google Maps and kind of collage in the sea around and the clouds. This was part of this kind of speculative sort of also exercises. Okay, and then of course collage, digital collage is great for architectural visualizations. This is from Matthew Turner. So you can of course do this as a kind of render. So you can kind of partially you can render the elements, meaning you can create a free model and render it using, for example, V-Ray in Rhino, and then bring it into Photoshop and then create maybe add textures and so on. So you can create a sort of a hybrid technique. This is again the same office, so made in, but these are now their projects. So project is called Mont Blanc in Geneva. So this is sort of a teaser image that they created, which is sort of this kind of a rough sea flowing over this kind of pier, and I guess this is the sculpture in Geneva. So this is kind of a completely a teaser image for this project here that was not built, at least not yet, where this is a real context. So this is just a photograph of the place, and then there is the project is actually here, or you can see this waterfall here. The idea is this is like a sort of an intervention where the lake would be sort of brought into this artificial waterfall, which would sort of kind of fall in front of this bridge here. So this is a lake. So in a way, they are kind of creating basically changing the waterfront of this in front of this bridge. So yeah, you can kind of have a sort of a teaser image that maybe tells a little bit of a story, and then you can actually have kind of a very subtle kind of context visualization of the project. Okay, this is another project with them where you would use again the maybe Rhino, V-Ray, so kind of different rendering techniques to create kind of a building, and then you would just collage it into the background. And here it's maybe even a little bit more kind of skilled, but this is not really hard to do once when you get the render correct, or then this sort of is just basically kind of cutting out this, and then blending the differences. So I'll show you a little bit how you can approach that in some later sessions. Okay, this is also basically, it's not really a rendering, it's also kind of a, it's basically, this is, I think, just a collage, or so this is the inside of this bachelor building, or so in a way quite plain, but they use symmetry again to add a certain appeal, and there's even a cleaner here, cleaner of the windows. Okay, this is a bit more standard. So this was a master thesis project from a colleague of mine, Stefan Devek, who is now an architect in Geneva, in Switzerland, and this is housed by the Limmat. So Limmat is it's a channel in Zurich. So there's kind of a channel, and then he designed a building here on the side, and here he used a little bit less photorealistic technique, so kind of a bit more sort of this collage technique. So you can kind of experiment, or you can experiment how much sort of realism do you want to add, and how much you want to look sort of almost like an illustration by kind of adding textures and so on. So I would say photorealism is not necessarily the goal. I mean, it can be a goal if you're if that's your style. This may be kind of more photorealistic, and this is more like kind of a collage style. And this you can already do with sort of slight adjustments of textures. Also, the question is, how would you add a texture here? How is this texture added using a blending mode? Also, you would have a texture, and you'd distort it to be in perspective. You would put it over the surface, which is maybe quite plain. Maybe it looks a little bit like this, quite plain. And then you would use a blending mode to kind of apply the structure of the texture onto this surface. And then, of course, you would cut it out nicely so that it cuts where the surface cuts. Also, that's where you could use, that's where you would use the blending modes. Or these reflections, it depends on how they're done, but you can also manually do them by just kind of flipping the image. Or I would take this image, I would flip these guys over, I would change them so they just become black, and then I would blend it onto the surface here. Or so I would just make it a really, really fine overlay. And in that way, I can, in a very rough way, already create kind of a reflection, make this floor look kind of shiny. Even though these are then, I mean, if you know something about perspective, you know that if you just flip a person, or if you flip an object, you're not getting a correct reflection. But it can be good enough, or depending on what you need. Or so it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to, sometimes it just needs to look good. Or okay, and you can of course go more into photorealism. So these are now the projects from. Just realized the time is running very fast. These are I think the last projects that I have to show you for today. So-called city portraits. So that's a series of digital collages, which are very speculative, from Victor Enrich. And again, in autumn, I already showed his project. So kind of, it's not really subtle in this case here. There's this house is completely flipped. Or so basically, yeah, you just use kind of photographs. Of course, you need a photograph of this building from the top, which can be hard to get. But once when you do it, you can create a collage like this. This is another one. This is Empire State. Oh no, actually, this is a Chrysler building, I think, from New York. Collaged. I'm not sure if this is New York or somewhere else. Or so, and these are, well, they call them. He calls them city portraits, but for me, these are almost like urban speculations. So this is maybe a little bit more the style where I would like to go with our assignment, or to have basically a context image that is just a photograph that you should take on your own. I'll explain that, because then you own also the rights to that image if you take it with your own phone, rather than if you just take it over. And then you use that image to basically, you can start working from there. Okay, some are simple, some are, so some of these, they don't really take a lot of work. So some of them you can almost do like in, simple afternoon if you know how. Some take a bit more work. This is actually the Senaten Kirkor in Helsinki. And some other examples. So this is the MIT building in Massachusetts. And for example, in examples like this, you actually do need to, you would need to go into rendering. So you would need to kind of create a 3D model of this part and then kind of render it properly and then collage it into a building. Also, this you cannot anymore do by sort of just collaging parts of the image together also, but this really depends on how much you want to achieve or how much you want to achieve. It is actually a quote from Victor Enrich. After closing my business, I can finally create impossible buildings without clients limiting my imagination. Also, he's just using Photoshop basically as a means of sort of for him to express himself. And I think that's quite successful. And this is also not kind of too far off for example, what Archigram was doing back in the 60s or so. They use kind of a collage technique as a representation, but also basically as a design. Or so Archigram was a group of architects from UK, I think, and they would basically take this idea of a collage. Again, this is the same time when the pop art was in or started. They would basically treat their cities as collages, and there's actually one reference also that I can give here. There's from Colin Rowe a book called Collage City. Also, somehow this collage as a technique kind of came into the fore, not just as a representation technique, but really as a way to design. Of course, this is you can think about, well, you can discuss about the relevance of this today. This is, of course, 60, 70 years ago, but back in the time, so these Archigram projects were then also very speculative, very futuristic, and these are actually some renderings then from the kind of current era. So this is 2017, where some of this thinking of Archigram kind of was taken on and here kind of reimagined. Well, we all know that the world is slowly sinking, and for London, we know that in some decades the London might be underwater. So there are a lot of architects there who kind of speculate about how London will look like when it's underwater, and Archigram as a kind of a UK-based group kind of feeds into the story. So these are just kind of sort of Archigram renders in the recent renders, but these are again just sort of collages more or less, and these are a bit better ones. So this is again London, and I guess this is the Tower Bridge, and yeah, here you need of course a bit more skilled. You need to do kind of proper renders. So here basically these this here, so this these walkers or it's very hard to do this as a kind of illustration or as a collage. You basically need to model it in, I just realized I wrote here Rhino incorrectly. Okay, you have to model it in a free modeling software. Rhino is one of them, but you can use 3D Max or maybe even SketchUp, who knows. And then V-Ray is a plugin for Rhino, which does visualizations. Also, you can kind of create a photorealistic render of that model. And then if you set the light and kind of, the light, reflections, everything, you can basically get this part here or in the correct orientation. And then you can sort of, with the Photoshop, you can collage it into this cityscape also. But the reason why it works here is because when it was rendered, when this model was rendered, they knew exactly what kind of light it needs, reflections, in order to make it sort of fit into the image better. Or it's also very easy to render something wrong, and then when you put it into this kind of a dusk cityscape, it will just not fit. You would see that it's kind of collaged in. But yeah, V-Ray is basically creating photorealistic renderings of 3D models, and that's basically how movies are done today, games are done today, and so on. Okay, assuming a role. So what's your role? Your role is basically I would like you to assume this role of kind of quote, I'm kind of this image of Ansel Adams, who's a famous photographer who photographed many of America's national parks. He was also a pioneer in photography. So he was kind of he was a photographer on the field, or so always kind of traveling. And this on the right is actually Victor Enrich, or so almost 100 years later, 80, 70 years, actually it's 90 years later. Again, so he's just he's an active observer of the city. Also, he has a camera, and he goes around the city and takes photographs. And for the assignment that you will do, we don't need good cameras, or so I would actually even encourage you to just use your normal phone. Assuming you don't have some kind of a 10-year-old phone, I assume you all have kind of normal phones, but even if you have a 5-6 years old phone, perfectly fine. Or so you can actually just use your phone to go around the city and photograph, and you can collect the material for your collages. And again, I will explain the assignment better next time, but this is a little bit your role. Or so you'll go around the city, Helsinki, and you'll take photographs and you will use them to create collages. Okay, and then that's the first part, collecting information, collecting photographs. And then the second part is the role of maybe Salvador Dali or Andy Warhol. Or so Warhol was also part of the pop movement. He also used collage in his also prints, but kind of collage in his as part of his artistic repertoire. And yeah, so they were kind of artists, that worked in these times where it was popular to sort of put things together sometimes in weird ways, or in Dali's case in a surrealist way. But I would actually argue that there's a certain resemblance between work of, for example, Victor Enrich and Salvador Dali, and yeah, kind of sort of this idea that you can use collage as a technique to express yourself. And of course, they were artists, but we are interested more in just sort of also observing the environment and, in a way, telling a story of the city. That's the main goal. Okay, so these two roles: photographers and observers, and basically artists are kind of collaging these things together.